Hello, colleagues, and welcome again to our next episode of DINCast, where today we're going to be exploring making better decisions with Chris Grant. Chris is the founder of 14A. He serves on various boards, including Sport England, and he's also an author as well, and has just published his latest book about making better decisions. So, Chris, welcome.
Ian.
Please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and I suppose your leadership journey.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here, Ian. And hello, everyone. Yeah, my leadership journey, I think the background to my leadership journey is about groups and group dynamics. I've always been fascinated in what happens in and around groups. Even when I was a kid going to a football match, I was kind of as fascinated by the crowd back in the days when we had crowds at football matches. I was as fascinated by that as I was by what was going on in the field. And that I was very lucky to be able to translate that into a career of facilitating, chairing, hosting groups in different contexts. And at a certain point, quite a long time ago, I realized I'd been in rooms with groups making decisions on maybe 2,500 occasions. And that got distilled into what has become better decisions.
And in terms of sort of, your work as a leader and a coach and what have you, obviously, the COVID crisis has brought to a head a lot of different, I suppose, views of how leaders have responded. I just wondered what your observations have been about how leaders and businesses have responded during the COVID crisis.
I think one really interesting aspect of what's happened in the last few weeks and months is a lot of people who don't necessarily spend a lot of time reflecting on their own practice have been forced to, because they've had some of the props or tools that they've become very used to using over the years taken away overnight. And I've noticed in the leaders I've spoken with, some have loved it and some have hated it. But all of them have had the opportunity, welcome or not, to ask themselves some questions about how they lead.
And in terms of some of the companies that you sort of will turn towards or look at, are there any ones that have particularly stood out, or you really you read up on them and you look for sort of their announcements? Is there any companies you particularly admire?
I think one sector that I've always been interested in is hospitality. And of course, they have suffered and are suffering massively through this crisis, and many businesses are facing an existential threat. And a company I've always looked at as a customer is Pret-a-Manger, or a brand, I guess I should say. And they've always interested me because it seems to me they've for a large part of their existence, they've kind of ticked that box or fulfilled that holy grail of getting their employees really, really engaged and really representing the brand well. So I haven't been able to see yet how they've handled COVID. I suspect they will have handled it fairly well.
Okay, so picking up, the publication of your book. I mean, as I say, you decided to sort of write it on making better decisions. Why did you pick on this particular subject?
I felt that it's one of those things which we take for granted a lot of the time. So it's decision making or taking. And one of the distinctions I make in the book is between taking a decision, which is that sharp, pointy bit at the end where you arrive at a conclusion, and what I describe as making a decision, which is an extended process of opening things up and then juggling them before reaching that point of taking a decision. I realized that it was something that most of the groups I worked with and many of the individuals I worked with had not given a lot of thought to how they were doing it. So it was one of those things where, rather than advancing our explorations into brand new territory, I thought I'd come back to some really familiar territory for people, but see if I could shine a light on it from different angles. And I'm fascinated by what shows up when you take a closer look at things that feel familiar to you. And that was part of my motivation for this book.
And the approach that you've taken is, I suppose, is to sort of, give the reader some, practical lessons and that's how you've sort of broken it down. Do you want to sort of pick out a few of the main ones that would help viewers in the current situation?
The way I come at it in the book is to start by talking about, well, what is a decision and what is the shape of a decision? And also a paradox, which is that I think in leadership, decisiveness is held up as something to be desired or sought out. You know, we don't want an undecisive leader. But on the other hand, if decisiveness means leaping to decisions, to me, it's the opposite of what a better decision maker does. Because as I said before, a better decision maker is someone who can get the data into their equation, can manipulate it, and then arrive at a good way forward. So the first part of the book talks about that shape of a decision. It also talks about when not to make decisions, and how I think some of the more skillful leaders I've ever come across have been ones who at different points chose not to make a decision. And that could have been for different reasons. It could have been because they were growing a team and they realized that if they made all the decisions, that left no room for their people to make decisions, which may not be the right ones or may not be the same ones that they would have made, but which would provide learning opportunities for their people. So at the beginning, I play around with this idea of, you know, what is a decision? What's the shape of a decision? When might we not make one? The middle of the book, the heart of the book, is about something which I call strategizing. So people talk about strategy a lot, the noun. And I often have noticed that organizations and individuals and teams may or may not have a strategy. Many of the ones who have got a strategy, which they may have invested a lot of time and effort in developing, then put it in a drawer somewhere and just get on with life. So the strategy isn't necessarily driving what they do. The more effective ones, even if they don't have a strategy, they know how to strategize. So at the heart of the book, I talk about triangulating through three perspectives. One is astronomy, the North Star, where are we trying to get to? One is geography, the more familiar stuff you might do around strategy, look through a SWOT or whatever, which is what's the landscape, where are the threats and opportunities. The more interesting one in many ways is what I call archaeology, which is within our team or our organization, what's digging down into what's the heritage, you know, what are we good at, where's our capacity, but also where's our baggage. What's the stuff that we as an organization are nervous of? Where's the difficult stuff? Where have we failed in the past? Where are our gaps? And for me, the capacity to be able to triangulate, as I say, between where are you trying to get to, what's going on around us, where's our heritage and baggage, those three things together bring us to what I call the fox perspective. So there's the old parable of the, you know, the hedgehog knows one big thing, but the fox knows many things. A good strategist is a team or a leader who can play with many bits of data and come up with the way forward for that moment. So that's the heart of the book, is strategizing.
And I suppose, you know, the current situation, Chris, I mean, leaders will be looking for, right, how do I make the right decision? But the challenge we have with COVID is if its scale and its impact and its global impact is nobody's been here before. So there's no reference points for leaders to sort of look at. So I just wondered, could you sort of talk us through how you would go about, you know, solving a problem or a challenge which you've got, as I say, no familiarity or experience with?
One step at a time, I think, is the answer. And actually, there are various strands I've had in my learning career, in my developmental career. One of the most important ones for me came about in the early 2000s, where almost by accident, I ended up in Nova Scotia at a conference being run by a load of Buddhists. And they brought together people from the world of academia, some genuine heavy hitters from the world of business, and people from a kind of secular Buddhist tradition, to talk about things like systems thinking. But also every day they taught a simple meditation practice, just focusing on the breath, and the focus of all that work is about being in the present. And to me, that's always helpful. And once again, some of the most powerful leaders I've worked with and most effective ones are the ones who are able to live in the present. Doesn't mean to say you ignore where you want to be a month or a year from now. Doesn't mean to say that you forget where you were 6 weeks ago. But having the capacity to make a decision, to recalibrate, to go around that continuous improvement loop of saying, okay, I'm going to make a plan, I'm going to implement it, I'm going to review what happens and replan, but being able to do that almost on a daily or a weekly basis, knowing that many of the things you decide may not come to fruition, but stepping through these days one day at a time, I think becomes really, really powerful and important.
And do you think that actually, we're not going to be able to look too far ahead, or leaders shouldn't be looking too far ahead? Because I would imagine, as I say, if you've got no reference points, the amount of information that you need to take a decision, or the data that you've got, is probably not going to be available.
Well, if you go back to my idea of strategizing, the thing which is really difficult in the context of what you just said there, Ian, is what I call geography. It's that, the capacity to scan what's going on out there, and that might be the broader economic situation or the socio-political situation that we're in or that we're entering. Admittedly, it's going to be really difficult for leaders to see the wood from the trees out there. However, the other two dimensions that I mentioned, in some ways, might be clarified through all this. So the North Star bit, the astronomy bit, which is where do we really want to be as an organization, as a service provider, or whatever? Where are we trying to get to? Now, that may have shifted through this time, but it ought to be clearer. And where have we come from? What are we good at? What are the bits of our organization that we can't afford to do without, even in times of difficulty? That could have become clearer too. So leaders still have the ability to strategize at this time.
I just wondered, how do you go about building a successful, high-performing team?
Well, I've had the privilege over the last decade and a bit, 15 years actually, of working quite a lot in the Team GB and Paralympics GB space. People who are building high-performing teams, not only in the stadium and the swimming pool and on the track, but the teams that support them, that should have been going to Tokyo in a few weeks, but hopefully will be going in a year's time for the Olympics and Paralympics. And the way that they build teams is through genuinely looking for a diversity of disciplines to come together. So I'm not saying that this functions well in every situation, but I like teams where people have come from different directions in their education, in the disciplines that they've shown an interest in. Diversity is something which is of massive interest to me through lots of lenses and prisms. I'm not a great fan, actually, of the tendency at the moment to talk about diversity of thought, diversity of thinking. Yes, of course, I agree that it's a good thing. My sense is that actually, if you allow people to think, to be themselves, you'll get that anyway. I like diversity of disciplines. I like diversity of social backgrounds. I like diversity of life experience, which may be associated with gender or gender identity or ethnicity or whatever. But then allowing people to make their full contribution, and still, from a leadership point of view, having the ability to bring that to a sharp, pointy edge in terms of saying, okay, so that's what we're going to do, and everyone buying into it, is something that I've seen happen a lot in the better functioning sports teams that I've worked with, for example.
And one of the issues, I suppose, within teams is that, as I say, you get that balance. But, a number of the high-performing teams that I've seen is quite often you would have a maverick or a contrarian or somebody who doesn't necessarily adapt to that sort of group dynamics. And sometimes, as I say, in high-performing teams, you need that person who can be a game changer kind of thing. Is that something that should be welcomed and nurtured, or is that actually over in the long term not a good team fit?
I think if someone gets painted into that corner, if they get stuck in that role typecast, I don't think it particularly helps. Because I think, you can assemble what you could see as being the desirable characteristics of a team, and think that you've got it right. But if particular roles are associated with particular individuals all the time, then you'll become a bit of a one-trick pony. For me, the much more effective teams, and one of the things that I've snuck into the book, even though the publisher said that some of my group dynamic stuff, and I understand what they were saying, was a bit technical originally, I've brought in some of the really interesting theory around how teams function, and particularly Wilfred Bion's work, where he talked about a team basically having two states. One state is the work state, where it's getting on with what it's meant to do. The other state is what he calls the security state, where it's dealing with anxiety. And every team has to manage anxiety in some way. But his insight was that if a team's in its security state, it's not doing its work. And a skilled leader knows how to navigate through the security state to get it to work. And that may not be a steady state, it may creep back. And sometimes it is the truth teller, the maverick, who will come in with the perspective that then takes the team back to its work. But I think if one individual gets stuck in that role, their tendency will be more to pull the team out of work, actually, and into something else. So for me, a really skilled leader is someone who lets their team fulfill the role that needs to be fulfilled in that moment. So it comes back to this living in the moment, not being a one-trick pony again.
And so what would a Chris Grant sort of interview look like in terms of, what would you be particularly looking for if, I was an individual and I was looking to sort of join your team? What would the experience look and feel like?
One of the things that I cover at the beginning of the book around decision making is agency. The sociological term is agency. It's to what extent do I take ownership of the fact that I can make a decision? And one of the reasons I mentioned Pret-a-Manger, one of the things that originally caught my eye about Pret as a brand and why I like them was that thing which is, they say to their team members working behind the counter, if you have a nice chat with a nice smile or something happens, you're at liberty to give them not actually just their coffee, but their whole order for free. You can say it's on the house, and there's no limit to how much a staff member can say that. Now, that's the organization saying, we trust you, but it's also saying we want people to work for us who are willing to make those decisions in that moment. And I think, I don't run a coffee shop, but for me, it doesn't matter if it's the most junior role in the team. What I'm looking for is a sense that someone has a spark within them, that they're prepared to say something which can add value. They're prepared to offer something from their perspective. I really like another, it's a bit of a cliche, but one of the role models for me in teams are not necessarily a traditional military structure, which has got that hierarchy, but those kind of special forces where actually they break down hierarchy so that anyone in the right moment can say what they're seeing, because they need that. The most senior person in the team may not be in a position to see where the danger is. The most junior person might. So you need the junior person at that point to feel okay to open their mouth. I ran a charity as CEO for 4.5 years, a Sport for Change charity. So it was a very long way away from a military situation. But I loved it. I loved it when the recent arrivals and junior people in the team would come up with something that felt like it added value, even if it wasn't where we ended up going. That the willingness to speak is what I look for.
And obviously, as a leader, and you've led many sort of, as I say, businesses as a CEO, to ensure that you are at your peak and you are supporting and leading your team, you need to look after yourself. So I just wondered, from a personal well-being point of view, how do you make sure that you're always at your best?
Well, what the final of the 5 chapters in the book is called Know Thyself. And self-awareness, self-knowledge to me is the core competence in most forms of leadership. And if you don't take time out to listen to yourself, so I mentioned earlier for me, for everyone, it can be different, the ways that we do this. It might just be a walk in the woods. It might be, an activity, going for a swim or whatever. But being willing to notice what's going on inside you is really important. And one of the reasons that I give for not making a decision sometimes is you may not be in the right shape to make it. You might be reacting rather than acting. So what I try to do is make sure that every day I give myself some moments of stillness where I can just reflect on how I am. And I also understand that for me, different people get their energy from different sources. I'm fascinated by groups. I love groups. I work with groups. Actually, on those tools, the psychometrics, I'm quite a strong introvert, which means that I get my energy from inside, and I get my energy from art, from music, from novels, not business books. So once again, if I've gone 2 or 3 weeks and I haven't been to a concert or listened to a beautiful piece of music, if I've gone a few months and I haven't read a really good novel that takes me somewhere really different, then I know that I need to adjust. So self-care is really important. Self-knowledge is critical, I think, in leadership.
And final question then, Chris, if from the book, if there was one particular point you wanted to leave leaders with around making better decisions, what would you share with them?
I think for me, and it connects to the last point about self-knowledge, there's something about taking decisions seriously, but not taking yourself too seriously. And actually sometimes even not taking decisions that seriously, because one of the observations I make in the book is that although a lot of us have to make quite a lot of important decisions, which may have an impact on quite a lot of people, there aren't that many decisions that we make which are kind of life or death or irreversible. And I think much more of decision making in terms of being cyclical and moving forward in such a way that, yeah, if I make a decision and it's not quite right, I can make another decision tomorrow that adjusts things. So sitting alongside that, this notion that you take the work seriously, but you don't take yourself too seriously. You don't always have to be right. It can be really helpful to have a bit of humility and to admit where something hasn't worked out, because in that admission could come the entry point to the next bit of success. I think politicians and government could often learn a bit about this, about being willing to say, well, yeah, that didn't go right. Because what you're doing in saying that is you're inviting the data in, if you like, which is going to help you make the better decision next time around. So take your work seriously. Don't take yourself too seriously would be my catchphrase, if you like.
And on that note, Chris, thank you so much for giving us an insight into how to make better decisions. And I look forward to working with you in the future as well. So thank you very much,
Thank
sir.
you, Ian. It's been great being with you. Thank you.